Hey everybody, Christian McBride here. When you think about all of the great jazz artists who have been wonderful band leaders, particularly small band leaders, everyone thinks of Miles Davis, they think of Coltrane, they think of Bird, Ornette Coleman. But there's a great bass player who led an amazing band many, many years ago. He often gets overlooked as one of the great band leaders of all time, Mr. John Kirby. And we're going to be focusing much on his music. Get ready.
Welcome to another in the National Jazz Museum in Harlem series on the SAVORY Collection. My name is Loren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the museum, and this show is dedicated to the music of the small bands. Now, we have already heard some small bands. They were jam session groups put together specially for jams. This particular show is featuring small bands that existed on their own, some culled from a larger big band, and some that existed on their own. And to take us through this music, we have two special guests, both superlative virtuosos and musicians, and who have recorded over the last 30 plus years on any number of classic albums, all the major jazz festivals, and are well known to jazz lovers and people who just love good music. The clarinetist Ken Peplowski and the drummer Kenny Washington. They are both scholars also, great historians of the music, and I can't wait to hear what they have to share with us about the music that we're going to hear. We're going to start with Mr. Washington, and he's going to take us through the music of the John Kirby Sextet. John Kirby was a tuba player and then a bassist with the legendary Fletcher Henderson Band in the early 1930s, and then eventually struck out on his own as a band leader. Now, it was one thing to be a pianist or even a drummer as a band leader. Most of the band leaders were horn players or singers. But a bass player? I mean, he really set the stage for people like Christian McBride and Dave Holland and Charles Mingus and Oscar Pettiford and so many others. These broadcasts, by the way, are historic not only for the music, but because it was the first time that an African-American jazz band had their own spot on a commercial radio network as a show in and of itself. I mean, there had been bands that had played on all the networks, live from a particular nightclub or ballroom or featured as a guest on a show. But the John Kirby Sextet had its own slot, first as a guest on a regular show, and then their own little broadcasts. And I say little only because they were relatively short in duration, but it was really a major moment in the industry and in American culture at large, and these are all from 1940. So, let's go to the music and Kenny Washington.
Boogie Woogie was that clap hands jive. We came into rehearsal, man, and John Kirby said, "We got no pause. Let's fool around here." Now, Billy's got some notes for Little Boogie Woogie. Prokop, you come in. Charlie, come on in. O'Neill, bring the drums in and make a section. We'll give out that Boogie Woogie.
You know, that particular track, Boogie Woogie, that really gives you a sense of, they were called the biggest little band in the land. They sounded like a big band, even though it was a sextet. I mean, these guys were on fire. The last part though, man, when it's playing the triplets, and I guess it was Buster Bailey playing a high F. Tight, man. I mean, tight. Russell Procope and Buster Bailey. I mean, they had worked together with Fletcher Henderson's band. Of course, O'Neill Spencer and Billy Kyle, they had played with, you know, with Lucky Millender's band. So, you know, they had and John Kirby as well, come to think of it, you know, and so they had a real understanding in terms of playing. There's nothing like playing together. You know, when you're playing together night after night, and certainly these guys are on the road with, as I said, several different bands. And so by the time the John Kirby Sextet came along, you know, well, they knew each other well, musically as well as personally. And that really makes the difference in the music. Not only that, they were playing every night. There's nothing like playing every night, man, you know. Things happen, and it's interesting, right? Because like that, by the time they got to the Savory recordings, because of playing every night, things would just happen. You know, just new guys, you know, Charlie Shavers would come up with something, and oftentimes, it was never talked about. It just happened. And it wasn't like one of these things when the gig was over, yeah, man, I like that. I mean, no, they just knew instinctively that, yeah, that was great. We're just gonna keep that in. We're gonna keep that in, you know. And see, so you hear layers and layers of riffs and all kinds of fantastic music.
Let's have one of those originals, John Kirby. Now let's have one of those things you made. We had to give them Milumbu every night in Berkeley. Man, we just had to keep playing that Milumbu piece.
John Kirby sextet, man, unbelievable, man. The way they played together. You know, it's one thing to hear the original recordings, the original 78s, but you know, when they get to play live, they open the music up so much. I mean, you hear riffs, like you hear riffs behind the different soloists, and it's also interesting. The great drummer O'Neal Spencer. I mean, this guy could play with a stick and a brush. He would play the stick with his right hand and play the brush with his left. And he had smooth transitions, like going from soloist to soloist, different sound for each one of the soloists that were in the band. But how he was able to switch from sticks to brushes, you know, I mean, just like seamlessly. And of course, the way the band played together, and Charlie Shavers, man, the articulation, man, you know, you hear like, you know, amazing, man. Dizzy always talked about Charlie Shavers. In fact, well, he and Charlie Parker, when they were coming off of their gigs, and Dizzy told me that they would sit right in front of the band, and Dizzy said both of them, he and Charlie Parker, had their mouths like hit the ground, man. And they couldn't believe how well these guys played together, the way they would breathe together. And this is when you hear Dizzy and Charlie Parker, like on things like Dizzy Atmosphere or some of these things like Anthropology, you can hear, of course, rhythmically, they're maybe a little bit more advanced, just maybe, but you can also hear where they got it from. The John Kirby sextet. Amazing, amazing.
It was weather like now when we made rehearsal. Man, was it hot. We were beat clear down. Charlie came out of rehearsal and said, I got a title for this one, Rehearsing for a Nervous Breakdown.
rhythm section, Billy Kyle on piano. Now he was a big influence on Bud Powell. But the thing about Billy Kyle is interesting. I mean, he was influenced by the great Earl Hines, but he had his own sound, and he had this thing he would play, you know, and the rhythm section in terms of the, you know, what's happening between O'Neill Spencer and Billy Kyle is very special. He had all these different sounds on the drums. Now, when it comes to, he was a brush master. And so he had these different rhythms that he would play. And each one of these, well, with the brushes, these different strokes and different ways you play certain things, you get different sounds. So, like, and he would change the groove up for each soloist. So a lot of times, well, it depends, man. Like so, you know, with, you know, he and Billy Kyle, man, they had something very special. See, so a lot of times when you listen, if you really listen to Billy Kyle's solo, you might hear O'Neill Spencer. He would play something like he'd be playing with brushes. So instead of he would, and so he would, you know, he would use his left hand. I mean, the beat is here, but that kind of thing. Sometimes, so, and then what would happen is, I still can't understand, even with the drum, especially back then with the drum equipment, the way it was, how he was able to switch from a stick and a brush or just two sticks. And one of the things he did, like you hear him playing, is he'll take his left hand and like, he's like right at the shank of the stick. And he gets half on the snare drum, he gets a little bit of the rim of the drum, the metal part, the metal part, and he gets the drum head. And he gets that, and he's playing time with his right on the hi-hat. So, you know, then he would change his sound. I mean, textures, man. He was a texture man, you know. I mean, there were other guys like that, of course, Papa Joe Jones, he's the one that started it. Certainly Sonny Gray with Duke Ellington. But these guys were masters of sound. But O'Neill Spencer had something very, very special. He was a great big band drummer. I mean, I'm talking about playing in a band bigger than this. People don't really talk about him. I mean, unfortunately, he didn't live long. It would have been interesting to hear his sound, like say in the hi-fi era, you know, when they were really doing great recording for, you know, for drummers. Same thing could be said of Big Sid Catlett, another guy. He just didn't live long enough, man. I really wish he had lived it into the 50s, you know, so you could really hear his sound and what he was doing. I mean, these recordings are great because I get an idea as to what he's doing, man. I mean, but his orchestrations, the way he sets the band up, you know, like I said, he's a sound man. He's like a, you know, drum texture man, you know? And it's just unfortunate that besides these recordings, there are some trio recordings or trio or quartet recordings with Billy Kyle and O'Neill Spencer's on those as well, finishing up a date. There's a few other things, but for sure, the John Kirby stuff, the John Kirby material, whether it be live in the studio or whatever, it doesn't get any better than that when you talk about O'Neill Spencer. He should be a study in schools, man. Nobody, except for me and a few other guys, really talk about him, man. He was fantastic, man. You know, another thing that I failed to mention is Billy Kyle's single note lines. His lines that he plays. Nat King Cole was another guy, of course, that I'm sure was influenced by by Billy Kyle. Of course, Billy Kyle is coming out of Teddy Wilson. He's got the elegance of Teddy Wilson, but he also has that rawness, that slick hip rawness of Earl Hines. It's combined, which is what actually Nat King Cole would do later on. But I'm sure that Nat King Cole was very much aware of Billy Kyle. His single note piano lines, when you listen to Bud Powell play, especially Bud Powell's early things, like say with Cootie Williams, you can hear how much he was influenced by Billy Kyle. He was an amazing, that's another guy that people don't really talk about. Later on in his career, he played great with Louis Armstrong's All-Stars. And Louis would give him a chance to stretch out now and again, but still, again, like O'Neill Spencer, these Billy Kyle sessions, these Billy Kyle recordings with John Kirby, that's the best. That's the best. The way they played together, and you can hear, like, from the studio record to this broadcast. I mean, you can hear Charlie Shaver's phrasing things a little bit, like he would driven, these kinds of things. And again, that's from basically just playing every night, But his articulation, Charlie, well, all of them. Listen, the front line, these guys could have been classical players if they wanted, man. I mean, they could do anything they wanted. That's how great they were. Dizzy told me, he says, look, he says, Charlie Shavers will make you cut your throat, And of course, when Dizzy came to New York City, via Philadelphia. Well, of course, he knew Charlie Shavers in Philadelphia, and Charlie Shavers helped Dizzy in terms of trying to get him in a couple of bands. But Charlie Shavers is the one that really showed Dizzy the insides to make him understand Roy Eldridge. They were both Dizzy and Charlie Shavers were both influenced by the great Roy Eldridge. But Dizzy was just coming up, and it's Charlie Shavers, man. He told me Charlie Shavers showed him exactly what Roy Eldridge was doing.
One of the most dynamic and talented and ahead of his time band leaders of the swing era was Cab Calloway. You know, Cab Calloway set the precedent for Little Richard and for Prince and for so many others. And not only did he have a great big band, but he had a small group. Unfortunately, they never made a studio recording, and there are only a very few recorded examples of them playing on radio shows. They were known as the Cab Jivers. It featured guitar, bass, vibraphone, and the brilliant tenor saxophonist Chu Berry. I think they were joined on occasion by someone that Chu brought into the band, an unknown trumpeter named John Gillespie, also known as Dizzy Gillespie. Well, in the Savory Collection, on the back side of a disc that had nothing to do with jazz, I think it was a Popeye radio show, there was a small little groove recorded on a blank side. And luckily, our engineer, Doug Pomeroy, saw it, decided to see what that little blip was, and it turned out being a minute of the Cab Jivers playing a blazing version of Liza with Chu Berry in incredible form. So, for educational reasons and cultural reasons, here is that wonderful clip. Tommy Dorsey had one of the great big bands for almost 20 years, from the mid-30s to the mid-1950s. He's famous for being just one of the most virtuosic trombonists, admired and respected by anyone who played the instrument, and many others too. He was a big influence, not only on trombonists, but on other people, such as Frank Sinatra, who always said he learned how to phrase and breathe from watching Dorsey when he was in that band. Well, throughout the early years of the Dorsey Big Band, he featured a small group. It was known as the Clam Bake Seven. And they made a lot of records. They were very good in kind of a smooth Dixielandish kind of style, I guess is what you would call it. And at times he had some brilliant jazz players on those records, including Dave Tuff on the drums and Bud Freeman on the tenor saxophone. This particular item comes from early 1939 when Dave Tuff was back in the band. You can see the personnel in front of you, all wonderful players. And this is the Sheik of Araby. And there are a lot of things to focus on, but I choose to focus on everything that Dave Tuff does at the drums. Anyway, a rarity from the Dorsey Clam Bake 7. And now we turn to the small group recordings of Benny Goodman. These are so important musically, but also for other reasons. Goodman was integrating his band racially at a time when that was not in his best commercial interest, I'll put it that way. But the music that came out of it was so important, and as one of those musicians, Lionel Hampton, used to say, people always talk about Jackie Robinson joining the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. They forget that Hampton and Wilson joined Benny Goodman's band 11 years earlier and really broke the color line there in terms of the entertainment industry. Well, you should know that all of the music that has been issued by the National Jazz Museum in Harlem from the Savory Collection is the result of an agreement between the estate of the band leader and the museum, and they receive a royalty. And this has worked, for Count Basie and Ella Fitzgerald and Lionel Hampton and all the other great artists, Fats Waller, whose music we've issued. There were a couple for whom there seemed to be no estate, and we have placed those royalties in escrow. However, the Goodman estate, for whatever their reasons are, have not allowed us to issue any of the material. We can play some of it here because this is for an educational project. It's fair use, and we're only playing a few, and they are placed purely in an educational context. However, we hope that someday the Goodman estate will see the light and let us share some of this music with the world. Time waits for no one. And the amount of people who are really interested in buying and purchasing, frankly, this music is diminishing. So anyway, we put this music out there with the hope that it'll engender a positive response. And in the meantime, we turn to Ken Peplowski, who is not only a brilliant clarinetist and saxophonist and humorist, but a serious scholar of the music for decades. And there's no one better to take us through this music than Mr. Peplowski. So let's go to China Boy. This is the Goodman Trio, recorded just before Thanksgiving, 1937, and we'll start here.
The chamber music department is already started. It's Professor Goodman and Doctors Wilson and Krupa with clarinet, piano, and drums. I thought I might surprise you with this one, but Dr. Wilson's beaten me to the punch. However, for those who don't remember, it's China Boy.
amazing. Like so much of that trio and the quartet from that period, they play with such abandon and joy, just unbridled joy. It's so great to hear that. And every version of China Boy is slightly different. There's always some surprise in there. I love the fact that Teddy is the hero as he's trying to very cleverly figure out, how am I going to play through the announcers, horning in on this, and he gets out of it perfectly and sets Benny up for the beginning of the song. You can hear kind of in Benny's first jazz chorus there, you can hear a few of his influences. You can hear some of those Jimmy Noon things that you can still find to this day in etude books, that could come from the concert band tradition, the things where he plays, those kind of phrases, and then very bluesy things, kind of Johnny Dodds influence things, but he makes it all his. Beautiful sound, and I love the clarity of this recording too. It's actually surprising and almost astounding that some of these Savory things sound so good. I just wish, and I'm so sorry that the estate doesn't do anything to facilitate releasing these to the public. I know Mosaic put out that fantastic box set, and it was very unfortunate to me that we couldn't hear all the great Goodman things in there. But I hope they change their minds. I know there's a real clamoring for that, and my editorial pitch to them, if they're out there listening, is if not now, when? Because people still want to hear this stuff. We're still learning from it, and I think if you don't release it now, you're gonna miss the boat. So I hope everybody gets to hear this great music. There's so much out there but unexplored that we haven't even begun to hear yet. One, I love Gene Krupa's drumming. To me, he is so musical and so busy. He's like the Elvin Jones of his day. He plays a lot, but it's always in service to the music, and both listening and feeding the soloist at the same time. And it's just fantastic. I think Gene Krupa gets a lot of short shrift over the years because we've heard so many bad Gene Krupa imitators, frankly, that think it's all about, the hair flying and gum chewing and, just da-da-da-da-da, but he is so musical, and that's three people playing. We forget this, and it sounds like an entire orchestra. There's so much going on, and there's such intensity on everybody's parts. It's phenomenal. So that was unusual for a few different reasons. First of all, it was rare for Benny to change keys on songs, even songs he played for 45, 50 years almost. He stuck to one key on those. So the big band arrangement was in E flat. He plays this in F as a clarinetist. You know, it makes you improvise differently. The other thing that's unusual about it is it wasn't often back then that he played small group arrangements of what were his big band staples. Later on in years, he would do that. He would play songs like "Don't Be That Way," but it was many, many years before you heard him improvising over some things like that. Also, it sounds like the quartet always sounded loose, but this sounds a little looser in the best way possible. It sounds like they're kind of finding their way through what their interpretation will be of this small group tune. Because, for example, it sounds like Lionel Hampton wasn't meant to take a second chorus, and it turns into a great second chorus, and Benny plays a rudimentary, riff behind him. And then there's a place later on where the rhythm section wants to give Benny a break, and it's kind of partially works, but it doesn't matter. It's so great and loose and swinging, and I love that track. So that was, interestingly enough, the very first version of what would be thousands of versions of Memories of You, with the quintet with Nick Fatul, Artie Bernstein, Jess Stacy, and Lionel Hampton, of course. Interesting to me is that Benny plays that introduction from the very first time out until just about the end. He loved that. He kind of honed that. He treats the melody almost like a classical piece. He does very similar things throughout the years with the way he treats the melody. And another observation of mine, Jess Stacy and Teddy Wilson broke the rules of what everybody's taught about accompanying people. They're all over the place, very busy, playing so much behind the soloist, and it doesn't matter. It sounds so great. Somehow they make that work. If you listen to any of those Benny records with Teddy, Jess, and even Mel Powell, it's a different way of accompanying, which we don't quite hear so much anymore. They fill up a lot of space. You hear that on the Billie Holiday small group records too. And it just gives everything this joyous, sound. They just fill up everything. It's interesting to me. I kind of miss that in a way.
And reading from left to right, Master sings Darn That Dream.
And they're going to play for you, I hope, roast turkey. That right, Benny?
That is so great, so swinging. Again, different key. He plays it in D flat, and now most people play it in the key of F. It gives it a whole different flavor. And Fletcher Henderson, again, people tend to write him off as a piano soloist. I loved that solo, very inventive. He may not have had the technique of a Teddy Wilson, but he's got that groove. At the end of a solo, he almost sounds like Count Basie, the way he's comping. And in fact, I don't know if it's Fletcher's influence or not. I'm going to say yes. It sounds like a mini big band arrangement. I kept waiting for something like a Steel and Apples or a King Porter riff from the big band. And you hear Lionel and Fletcher and Charlie Christian both all playing these figures behind Benny and just building and building. And Nick Fatul, very loose and at the same time making the hits. So it's almost a mini big band chart on that. It's so beautiful. It's so great to hear these. Again, fantastic sound quality. And come on, Goodman Estate, get these out so the rest of the world can hear this.
There are few figures who had as profound an effect on American musical culture starting in the late 40s going through the 50s than the alto saxophonist Louis Jordan. And we're going to hear all about it here from drummer Kenny Washington, so I need not spell it out. But these particular air checks are from a club in Harlem, the Elks Rendezvous, and they're from early 1939, and they're just from the time when Louis Jordan started recording under his own as a leader. And they don't sound like the famous records that we know, Five Guys Named Mo and Caledonia and all the big hits that Louis Jordan had. This is the very early Louis Jordan, so these recordings are tremendously important. And we'll start with something called Don't Be a Drag, and then we'll go to Mr. Washington, Kenny Washington, who's going to take us through Louis Jordan's music.
because Louis Jordan, before he titled the band the Timpani Five, this was Louis when he had left Chick Webb's band. He went on and he started the Elks Rendezvous Orchestra. And so this is before the Timpani Five, before the name the Timpani Five. And the reason why he got to call the band, he started calling the band the Timpani, Louis Jordan and his Timpani Five, is because the drummer was Walter Martin, I think that's his name. Walter Martin, along with having the drum set, he had a timpani. And on some of the early records, you could hear how, you know, during some of the breaks, he would play the timpani like, even boom, you would hear that. So Louis came up with the idea of naming the band Louis Jordan and his Timpani Five. And even though it would later on become more than 5 musicians, it was always the Timpani Five. Because, I mean, of course, you know, he went on to record for Decca Records. In fact, he recorded with Decca for a good portion of, well, the 30s, 40s, going into the 50s. He even had a big band for a while. Oliver Nelson was in the band. It was crazy for him to start a band that late, way after the swing era. But he did it anyway. Financially, it was a disaster, but they did make a few recordings. But Louis Jordan is the father of rock and roll. He is the father of without Louis Jordan, there wouldn't be a James Brown, a Little Richard, and all these kinds of people. I mean, now we're hearing the instrumental side of him on that track, Don't Be a Drag. And he was a fantastic alto saxophonist. And he could play some stinky blues, boy. He could play some blues. And if you think that Charlie Parker for a minute was not influenced by Louis Jordan, I think you better guess again. And if you listen to the Red Norvo Selected Sextet, Slam Slam Blues, you listen to Charlie Parker, there's a blues, a slow blues in B flat. If you listen to that, and then you turn around and you listen to any of the early Louis Jordan recordings, where Buzz Me, that's one of them. You can hear how much he was influenced by Louis Jordan. And certainly Cannonball Adderley, Lou Donaldson is another one that was, you know, greatly influenced by Louis Jordan. But Louis Jordan was a big name. He was so bad, man, this guy would have like 6 or 7 hits at the same time in the 40s. He was big business, man. But he was a fantastic entertainer, a great alto saxophonist. You know, and his hit records like Beware, Brother Beware, and 5 Guys Named Mo. All these kinds of recordings, you know, they're fantastic. But he could really sing a ballad too. I mean, he could be a clown on the stage, but when he wanted to, he could sing a beautiful ballad. Trust in Me. He did Trust in Me with his big band. And there's another tune called Garamucci. If you check it out, Garamucci. And the alto saxophone player on that record is not Louis Jordan, but it's Oliver Nelson, the great arranger, man, and composer. You know, a Blues and the Abstract Truth, that Oliver Nelson, he was around playing Louis Jordan's band in the early 50s. And if you listen to Oliver Nelson, like say that record Screaming the Blues, he plays a whole lot like Louis Jordan. So Louis Jordan was a very important figure. I mean, listen, man, they were all this R&B, and he's the king of the R&B jump bands, you know, and there was so many bands that tried to pattern themselves after Louis Jordan. There was a saxophone player in Chicago named Buster Bennett. He played just like Louis Jordan, man, you know. But he was an amazing, he was just an amazing figure in music. as an entertainer, as a saxophonist. I mean, he had it all. He really had it all.
At the Swing Cats Hall. Come on, let them send your body at the Swing Cats Ball. No time to lose, please don't be tardy. Tomorrow night at the Swing Cats Hall. Get in the groove with everybody at the Swing Cats Ball. Some will shake while others drag. Some will bump while others jump. Park Avenue will do their swinging tomorrow night at the Swing Cats Hall. You can't refuse to join in swinging at the Swing Cats Ball. They sound fantastic. And that's the first time, at least these series of recordings, we had a chance to hear Louis Jordan as a vocalist. Of course, as time would go on, many of his records would become hits as vocals, so you heard less instrumentals. So it's interesting always to hear the instrumentals. But the thing that knocks me out is, if you know these Decca recordings, he was a Decca artist, and if you know these early recordings, at least the studio recordings, it's amazing how close they sound. I mean, they're alike. It's the same thing. These bands had a sound. They had a very, very, very personal sound, man. You know, and the more I listen to these live recordings, and again, there's no overdubbing. There's none of that funny time stuff. They're playing as is, and it's just you know, amazing. I was just sitting there thinking, wow, man, they sound just like the recordings, you know, just as good, maybe even better.
We've been sailing along, friends, with that sizzling syncopator of uptown Manhattan, Louis Jordan, whose bouncing rhythms come to you from the famous Elks Rendezvous. Remember, 3-floor shows nightly at the Elks, produced by William Campbell. Never a cover charge here, and it's an ideal place for private parties. Johnny Burns is in charge of all reservations, so give him a buzz, won't you, if you wish to arrange for a table. Listen in again for more programs by Louis Jordan and his music from the Elks Rendezvous, 464 Lenox Avenue at 133rd Street, uptown Harlemtown in New York City. This has been a...
That tune is titled Approaching, and they used the same, he recorded a piece titled Swinging from the Coconut. I think it was called Swinging from the Coconut Tree, and they used the same bridge. I mean, so it's interesting to hear, you know, Louis Jordan play some of the same things he played on the Decca record. I mean, they changed the melody, but the harmonic progression is just about the same. That band, they were swinging, man. I mean, they had a lightness to them, a lightness in terms of sound, man. I mean, but you know, but it was almost like Muhammad Ali type things, you know, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And it's interesting to hear Louis Jordan. Sometimes, like, at least in this early period, he reminds me a little bit of Pete Brown. You know, the way Pete Brown would push the beat, you know, but it's swinging at the same time. Yeah, that's a great piece. That's a great piece. You know, it's a funny thing about Louis Jordan's band. Man, it was years, and I'm talking about in the last 5 to 10 years that I was able to find out any kind of a personnel on who was playing. I mean, the reissues that came out through the years, I mean, I own them all. The swing time bootlegs, all these things, and there was never a personnel anywhere. And it wasn't until this Bear Family box set that came out that they finally had the personnel, and I was able to, you know, find out who these guys were on these recordings. And apparently, their names don't really show up on anything else except for Louis Jordan records. I mean, there was a trumpet player, man, Aaron Eisenhall. He was in Louis Jordan's band. I think he replaced the trumpeter that's on these recordings that we listen to. I tell you who else was in the band for, you know, who recorded with him was Idris Suleiman. You know, he recorded with the band. Shadow Wilson recorded with the band, but most of the guys that came through Louis Jordan's band, they were fantastic musicians. But this is the only time that that you really get a chance to hear them on recordings. And when I was a kid, my father had the record with he had the '78. 5 Guys Named Mo on it. And I think maybe, I don't know, what was the flip side? Well, I could be wrong about that, but I remember what's the use of getting sober if you're going to get drunk again? You know, and I guess it was like an album. Well, they call them albums. They call them albums now, but it was like a Louis Jordan album. And they had a picture of him on the cover. And I remember I got so wrapped up in Louis Jordan. In those days, in the 60s, downbeat, believe it or not, would come out like on stories of some of these guys. And I remember they had a picture of Louis Jordan in the magazine, because I cut it out, man, you know, because my father was so upset with me because he hadn't gotten finished reading the Downbeat magazine. See, so whatever the story was he was reading about, it would say, go to page 15, and they go to page 15, and there's like this big cutout where I didn't cut out the picture of Louis Jordan. So I had this picture of Louis Jordan on my wall for a long time. You know, it's the picture.
it's a classic picture of him, like where he's like, it's like his face is like, well, who the hell are you looking at, man? And I'm telling you, the eyes would follow you, man. The eyes would, at least that's what I thought. The eyes would follow you. You'd walk, I'd be in my room and I'd have this picture of Louis Jordan and I look at it like he was like looking at me like, you know, but I was, you know, to this day, I'm a big Louis Jordan fan, you know. Unfortunately, by the late 50s, you know, I mean, he actually made some records. He made tried to make some comeback records. There's a record where Quincy Jones did the arrangements, but they never could jumpstart his career. Then he turned around, I mean, and I'll tell you somebody else who was a big influence on him. And if you really listen closely, you can hear how much he's influenced by that. That'd be Ray Charles. Let the Good Times Roll, Ray Charles got that from Louis Jordan. But what happened was that, you know, Ray Charles, when he got his own label, Tangerine, he took it upon himself to actually call up Louis Jordan to record him, to sort of kind of help jumpstart his career. Incidentally, Ray Charles is an alto saxophone player. And if you listen to Ray Charles playing alto saxophone, boom, Louis Jordan. The Louis Jordan for sure. And it wasn't until way after he died, he had to play, which was called on Broadway, which was called Five Guys Named Mo. And see, so that created an interest, at least for a while, in this guy, Louis Jordan, because no one knew who he was, man, you know. And of course, the reissue companies, Decca, started reissuing more of his, you know, his recordings. But he's one of my favorites, man. I mean, I play and listen to Louis Jordan all the time, man. So it's great that it's great to hear some new Louis Jordan from the Savory Collection. Fantastic.
We will conclude the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's The Savory Collection listening session and talking about session to the small groups with undoubtedly the least well-known group, at least in 2020, and this is the Joe Mooney Quartet. Joe Mooney. Well, you'll hear all about Joe Mooney from Kenny Washington, but suffice it to say that he was sightless from the age of 10, a brilliant arranger, pianist. He had an accident. In his 20s, he had to learn to play the accordion because he couldn't sit at the piano for a while. And regardless of what instrument he played, he also played the organ. He sang wonderfully. Frank Sinatra and many other people I should say they went gaga over his phrasing, his arrangements, his harmonies, his elegance, just his sense of humor, which was kind of really out there, placed him in a very, very special place in American musical history of the 20th century. We have one item to share with you to conclude this session, and then we'll hear from Mr. Washington.
Do you long for oolong like I long for oolong, baby? Do you long for oolong like I long for oolong, baby? Oh man, what a boot for my long tender shoe of oolong. Can you imagine me with you upon my knee? Tea for two and two for tea. Me for you and you for me alone, dear. There'll be nobody near us to see to hear us. No relations on weekend vacations, we won't have it known. We own a telephone. Blue about the light of dawn break, and you'll awake. Start to bake a sugar cake just for me to take, so all the boys can see, dear. We will raise a family with a boy for you, a girl for me. Can't you see how happy we will be? Are you gone on Ceylon like I'm gone on Ceylon, baby? Are you gone on Ceylon like I'm gone on Ceylon, baby? Oh man, what a boot from a long tender shoe to Ceylon. 1983. Chick still on his knee. She goes for he, but he's up to his eyeballs in T-balls. And there's for nobody near 'em to see or to hear 'em. No relations on weekend vacations. They've never been known to answer that telephone. Blue to bother, lot of dawn breaks. She awakes, still bakes those knocked out cakes. They've never been tasted, but they're not wasted. They're so pretty to see. They started to raise a family, but the kids left home at the age of 3 singing ooh-la, too much of that ooh-la. And now since the kids departed, the family is right where it started, back to tea for two.
Joe Mooney, fantastic accordionist, and he played piano and he sang as well. The first cat to tell me about Joe Mooney, God rest his soul, was Bucky Pizzarelli. I mean, he loved that group, right? And see, I had never heard Joe Mooney except with the Sauter Finnegan Orchestra. He had like a semi-hit with the Sauter Finnegan Orchestra. Was Eddie Sauter and Bill Finnegan. They had a very interesting big band in the 50s, and they recorded for the RCA Victor label and one or two other labels. But anyway, he had a semi-hit, a tune called It's Mutual. And that was Joe Mooney. That's the only thing that I knew about Joe Mooney. And I liked that recording, and I liked the way he sang. Because now, he's coming out of Nat King Cole. There's no doubt, you know, the jive lyrics. And I mean, these are the kinds of things that Nat King Cole was doing. And he was the king of that kind of stuff. And he had a drummerless trio. And if you listen to any of the Nat King Cole Capitol recordings, you know, any of the Straighten Up and Fly Right, any of those things, the arrangements were always so hip and so slick. But what knocked me out about Joe Mooney is like he, in a way, first of all, he wasn't playing piano. He could play piano. But on these recordings, he played the accordion, which is not an instrument that's associated with jazz too tough. So then he has an accordion, guitar, and clarinet, and bass. And so the ensemble sounded different, but you could hear arrangement-wise how he was coming out of Nat King Cole, some of the things that Nat King Cole did. But then he even took it a step further. I mean, harmonically, and some of these rhythms and things he would do, some of that stuff was even slicker than Nat Cole, some of Nat King Cole stuff. But you can hear how much he was influenced by the Nat King Cole trios. You know, those arrangements are really, really involved. Hip changes of keys. You know, I mean, the whole thing, it's entertaining, jive lyrics, you know, some of the things that he's saying, you know. But this was a fantastic group, and I'm so glad that no one talks about Joe Mooney. Absolutely no one. I mean, he made some records later on. There's a record, I believe Milt Hinton and O.C. Johnson are on it for Atlantic, and there's still another record, and Gary Burton plays vibraphone on it. I remember that record as well. But these early sides that he did with that great group, that's the best. And of course, again, you know, courtesy of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, you can hear this material. So please, people, tell your friends, your enemies, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, anybody. Tell them, hip them to the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. And the stuff is on YouTube. It's out there, man, for education. You know, all you musicians, man, y'all should be checking this stuff out. It's never been issued. This material has not been issued. So please spread the word around. And Lord knows the times that we live in now, we need this music. Trust me, trust me. You all be safe.
Thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you to Ken Peplowski and Kenny Washington for the expert commentary. And we hope you'll join us next Monday at 3, if you're watching this on Facebook Live, or whenever you'd like if you're watching it on YouTube, for another segment in the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's The Savory Collection series. And I'll also let you know that the Jazz Museum is doing all sorts of online programming. This is just one part of it. There's a lot of live music, live discussion, and you can find that all out by going to the museum's Facebook page or, of course, to our website, the URL of which is located on the screen that you are currently looking at. Thanks again.